a lot of times when you write, you'll default to certain habits of thought. You'll like pair certain words together, and you'll find the easiest thing to write so that you can keep your scene going. More often than not, when you come back and reread it, or when your beta readers or your friends read it, um, it will not have the drive and the punch that you're hoping for because you have lost the power of some of your words. Now, a lot of writers or write teachers and so on will waggle their fingers against adjectives and adverbs. So, too many descriptory, um, adjectives as and too many adverbs. So, words ending in ly, smiling quietly, walking quickly, crying angrily, that sort of thing. And they have their place, obviously. But I ended up finding this several times in the chapter that I was just writing how, one, it's easy to default to that because that's kind of how we want to talk. But these can be, as one author once described them to me, they can be like vampires in your prose, and they can suck out all of the life and the energy and the movement and the crackle of your prose. And this is where it leans into the whole show don't tell um, writing advice. So here's two things then that I am doing to try to keep up the energy, to keep things feel fresh, and to use my writing to keep pulling in the author and keep things interesting. So avoid default character settings for reactions. Okay, that's one. So what does that mean? That means when a character goes to react to anything, feeling mad, angry, hungry, whatever, the default reaction is to simply say that, right? Um, or to use an adverb to say somebody responds angrily to a thing. And if you want to make the scene more interesting, this is what I'm doing, is you avoid doing that, and instead you find a way to describe the feeling. Now, for most of us, especially if you've been writing or messing around with it for a little while, this feels pretty um, unsurprising, but it can be very easy to default back into it. So instead of just describing the fact that somebody has a feeling, you describe what it feels like to be feeling that feeling, perhaps the resistance to it. So instead of saying that you're hungry, maybe there are other things that a character notices about themselves, like the fact that they are crabby. They wonder when the last time was that they did eat, or the fact that they're looking forward to the fact that there's maybe a particular meal they want to get to. And if that's running in the back of their mind, that's impacting how they're acting. It's affecting who they're dealing with. Maybe their blood sugar is low and they are suddenly crabby or frustrated or obsessing over something and they don't quite understand why. Or if you are, um, let's say, not hungry. What's another example? My characters walked into a room that was full of all kinds of memories, and it sort of threatens to overwhelm her and bring all kinds of feelings back. And I'm trying to not make it feel cheesy and like over emotive or, describe it strangely or something. So at this point, obviously, beta readers are going to be more helpful than I can be at this point. But um, as I'm writing it, instead of just saying the name of the feelings, describe the feeling of the feelings and then what items in the room or what thoughts come to her mind when she feels them. And so I think that's kind of the first thought, is avoid the default setting when you enter into a scene. Avoid the default response that our minds would go like, oh, um, she feels resentful. Well, don't say that. How do you show that? What are the physical actions that somebody needs to go through if she is feeling like resentful, or the character is feeling resentful or whatever? Then is she owning that or is she rejecting that? Because if she doesn't want to be feeling that, then what does she do? Does she uh, try to force a different feeling, right? And here's where you look at your own life. You look at how you act as a human being, as a person, and in this sense, you don't really need to go anywhere or study anything. You just look at yourself. How do I react? Start paying attention to yourself. Sometimes you're resentful that somebody's intruding on your time, and you don't want to be there paying attention to, let's say, this thing, but at the same time you recognize it's important to this person, and you figure it's just easier to see the thing through rather than straight up say what you want. And then maybe you realize if I wasn't acting with such bad grace, I might actually learn something right now. Um, so that's a little more. I mean, now what have we just communicated? The relationship with the other person is also important. Begrudgingly, you might actually learn something. The fact that you don't want to be here, why? Because you want to be doing something else, which is what, right? So avoiding the default setting can actually allow for a lot more detail to come through. And of course, it's a lot more interesting to read. And heck, it can be a lot more interesting to write because you're it's like adverbs and so on can be like zip files. They can take a lot of information, compress them down into a single word. That can be boring to write, and it can be slightly boring to read. It's a lot more interesting to unpack that zip file, uncompress what that idea means, and turn that into something that you can communicate, into the different steps of that feeling. Chances are you do that and you can pull your readers in because now they can start feeling that more accurately as well. Merely saying somebody is frustrated is not as powerful as saying that somebody slams a cup down, throws something across a room, or perhaps, you know, scrunches their hand together so hard their knuckles pop and they close a door so that it doesn't make a single noise and grit their teeth. Those kinds of little things are more vivid than just simply saying somebody was frustrated. So that's what I'm trying to do. The other thing is that I always recommend wherever you can, it's not always possible, have a sidekick or a friend to talk things through. And I think you'll see this more often than not, like in movies. This is done a lot in movies. You to avoid too much narration and introspection. And often, as we're writing chapters, it can be really easy to use this sort of narrative thought flow to intrude all sorts of information that we want to communicate about the past, about what the character wants, and so on. And then you can end up spending pages and pages and the character's only done maybe one or two actual things and nothing has actually happened. There's been no movement that's actually happened in the scene. I'm afraid that might have happened with the chapter I just wrote where she steps into a room and then there's just a ton of introspection. Maybe that's something that needs to happen because there was a lot of action in the past few chapters, so it might be okay. But as I'm looking at that, I'm thinking, what does she need to do to keep movement, like quite physical movement or flow happening? If things are static and solid and not moving, even if the thought flows are purely objective kind of reflections on what's going on, it can again feel like things are not moving. Again, it depends on what you're communicating. It could be the value of the information is finally, like the reader is like, finally, I get to learn this stuff. You've been holding out on me for so long. I need to know these details. And so then that also can work. But having a friend or an object, or like Disney princesses will have sidekicks or something, or um, Wilson, right? On what was the name of that movie with the island, the guy Castaway, and he humanizes a soccer ball to be able to have a conversation because humans have to articulate, have to talk, and it's of course a lot more interesting to read as a reader because you're seeing back and forth happening as opposed to blocks of introspection. Khaled, you got a great point. Show, not to say. Exactly. Which is actually a pretty good riff on instead of just telling somebody in the prose, sometimes you can also simply say something straight out in conversation or in a line of dialogue. And, you know that you want that to be said because the character has to communicate that. But the problem is and you're maybe afraid the reader thinks that nobody would actually talk this way. And that's like a good example of that whole line, well, where someone says, well, as you know, here's where we are with this and that situation. The problem with that is, of course, if somebody already knows that, why are you saying that? And so there's a prompt. When you find yourself getting into that stage, there's an opportunity to go, okay, what do I need to rework here so I don't say something like that? Do I need to bring in a new character? Do I need to bring in a new piece of information that changes everything? Maybe I need to not say this at this point, and maybe we need to keep people guessing, or maybe the person who knows everything doesn't want to say anything because suddenly they realize there's something very seriously wrong. Usually, what movies and a lot of stories will do is keep the pacing up, keep the danger up for the first 30% of the story. To really get you and the characters to commit to the fact that everything is in danger and broken and weird and wrong or whatever, so that when they are ready to start sharing bits of information, um, the author has felt like they've earned the right to actually start sharing that. So having a sidekick or a character or a friend prompts you to pull out of your mind and out of your thinking space. I was reading um, opening chapter somebody had shared to a story that they were writing, and it was very dramatic, and there was a lot of movement and a character running through a forest, and everything was in the character's head. And yes, that can happen, but the problem is when somebody is in a fight or flight situation, there is not a lot of blood flow to your critical thinking faculty. Everything is survival. And so it's just interesting how, of course, when you're bought in seat, um, you're not actually going through that, and you think, well, I could probably, somebody who is running for their life might actually use these kinds of words, might actually think these kinds of things. They're doing a little bit of introspection. We've got to set up a little bit of backstory. And honestly, not really. Um, there might be like a very little. And this is actually, okay, so here's another tip. Depending on what the pace is, the speed of what you're writing, match your word choices to that. So if someone is in danger, and if there's a lot of speed and a lot of motion, I will opt for very short, very simple words, because that is how that's like your level of awareness is. Um, for what I try to do for my characters, I speak through them. I don't do a lot of narrative third person. If I do write third person, it's like a very close first person. It's basically first person from a third person writing standpoint, because I want to stay really, really close to the characters as a way to force me to do more of the showing and not the saying, like college says, more of the showing, not the telling. Um, so if somebody is running or in danger, short words, very short phrases, short things, super simple. No big words, nothing ostentatious. Now, when a character, of course, on the other end is more relaxed, has more time to think, then the sentences can ramble a little longer because you're free to daydream, enter into reverie a little bit more. And that way, your writing style also matches the awareness of your character, which is kind of how you are when you're going around through your day. So, honestly, learning to pay attention to yourself can be, well, is honestly the best way to start helping your characters to be a little more dynamic and help your scenes crackle with a little more life and a little more drama, because you're coming out of the head awareness and down into the actual sensory things. Um, so Khalid makes a comment here. He has a problem with the characters. I have no idea. Sorry, I have an idea of the world. There are no effective characters or heroes. I know that problem because I will always start with an awesome idea, and then I have to go figure out a character, and that can sometimes be a nightmare, and I can take forever to try to figure out who is a compelling character or a compelling hero. This novel that I'm actually writing right now is kind of like that, where I created this story arena. This would be amazing to create this character, create a story like this. And then I realized, well, now I've got to create a really compelling character. And it's taken me forever to figure out the character. I think I'm finally at a point, which is why I'm doing these live streams, where they make sense, because I intuited who the person of the character is. And every time I try to write and add new things to them, it doesn't feel right. So I have to get rid of all of that and come back to trying to describe who this person is, because she has to be able to hold an adventure. So here's one thought. This is something I read years back, which I think is really good advice. When you're trying to create or find out who the character is in your story, find out, how do I say? Find out who in this world is enduring the most amount of pain. And that's probably the character that is going to be a compelling person to carry your story. So sometimes you'll start with like, gosh, I've done this. So many people do this. Here's a cool world, medieval fantasy world. There's dragons in it. Okay, I probably want a prince, because a prince is going to have the freedom to marshal armies and go about, do things or whatever. Well, if we want to brainstorm a little bit about that, you could also argue, no, a prince has basically no freedom to do anything, certainly not to go questing or adventuring, because the line of the kingdom depends on their safety. And they have a ton of people who depend on them. In fact, a prince only stays alive because he has a set of farms paying him tribute. And if anything happens to them, then he can't afford his lifestyle, right? So there's a specific, there are certain parameters to being like royalty or a prince that you can't, that are hard to get around. Now people do because it's traumatic or whatever. I mean, if now let's say you're a Ronin or a samurai, or not a samurai, like a wandering knight, a knight errant. Like, well, this seems like a great kind of person to be out there. Well, at the same time, think of them like the Witcher, right? You have no guaranteed food source, no guaranteed heat source. You're constantly out in the wild. Maybe, that's why Geralt is mad all the time. You don't have a consistent source of food and personal safety, always looking over your shoulder. Um, Maybe that's an interesting character to kind of work with. But if you evaluate your world and you look at who is the person who is enduring the most pain, it could be someone who's like a slave. It could be somebody who is like um, somebody who's selling textiles door to door, and they can't make it work. And they have, of course, they want a family. They have a family. They got a ton of pressure on them. They have deliveries that have to be made. Maybe there's a guild that operates like a mafia, and so the pressure kind of builds on that person. Heck, maybe they are the guard who opens the door, and this guard discovers he has a creeping condition, right? And so now the door to the front wall or something. Um, I don't even know. I'm just making up stuff. Whatever you end up doing, I think if you find that, because what is the opportunity if somebody is in a lot of pain, you can then surround that person with a couple of other examples. If a person is enduring a ton of pain, the response to that is to either level up or fall over and die or give in. And so maybe have a character have two examples in their life. Somebody who does keel over and give in, maybe somebody who's excessively brave and ends up killing themselves or getting themselves damaged or something, because they didn't control that. And so that creates two wings for like your main character to think about. Maybe I need to do something like this instead. Um, so, what do you think about that? Um, I will usually try to think about that if I'm trying to find a character, somebody who is in an impossible situation. The more impossible, almost the better, because it means I'm going to have to really work to get them to level up and maybe do things that I did not expect. Um, so yeah, for my character, I had to actually kind of go the other route of, she seems like she's got it together, kind of a cool character. I needed to introduce a ton of pain or sort of suffering to get her to stop being a Mary Sue, to get her to stop being kind of a perfect, adventurous person with an easy life. She needs to be somebody who is struggling. Okay, so you mentioned, last question, that's great. I'm happy to chat with you. Is it normal for the tournament to be for a group of people, not one person, and for the events to be narrated from the point of view of the characters? What I'm hearing is, so you're talking about like a medieval tournament with a bunch of different knights or warriors in it, and they're all fighting each other with like blunted weapons to see who's the last man standing. If that's what you mean, give me a thumbs up. Um, so obviously they are for a group of people. If there's one person standing, um, the difficulty with something like that is if you stay with one person, you may run the risk, science fiction, so a science fiction tournament, but same sort of idea, I'm guessing. If you stick with the one person who survives the whole way through and is the last man standing kind of thing, um, you'd have to be careful that they actually endure a ton of pain. They can't just be, unless they're like Lancelot, and then in that sense they feel slightly unbelievable, dropping into a sort of war situation and then punching through everybody and being the only survivor. Staying just in that person's head could be tough, or it could be just a great demonstration of what an amazing warrior they are. But if you do jump heads, that's where you'll need to be really careful. I have done this. A lot of people have done this. You have to not lose the reader. You'll have to very carefully define the different voices of the characters you want to jump around in. You might not want to do a ton of people. You might want to keep it limited to a very specific set of people with very distinct voices or very distinct action styles. and distinct weapons. And that's kind of the big thing, is distinction, so that when you jump between them, it's easy to tell who you're paying attention to, especially if you're going to keep doing it multiple times throughout the chapter. Um, Make sure, I would recommend that you delineate very clearly between the different voices that you're using. So, like using the three asterisks that are centered to indicate there's a break that is now happening between the flow of the fiction. I've seen people who have written chapters or have written stories, and they're jumping in between the different characters' heads, and you have no idea you're in somebody else's head until you're like halfway through, and then the other person starts talking, and you realize, wait, I thought the story was being told from that person's head. I have not read Song of Ice and Fire. I started the first book. Um, what does he do, Khaled? Maybe you can share. I haven't yet read that. Um, Obviously, with a story like that, it's got a lot of characters. Um, but if I'm from in watching the series, the they have each character is very distinct, and they speak in a very distinct way. Obviously, with a movie, it's very easy to pay attention to different people. In stories, you have different tools that you use. The visuals, not so much. The use choice of words, reaction times, um, how they feel about things, how they react to things, is those are more the tools of the writer, because it's coming out of more of the inner life. Um, so I don't know if any of this was helpful. If our watchers have any other ideas, please go ahead and help me flesh out these ideas. How are you tackling these? So here's for writing a better scene. Just recap the thoughts that I'm walking through today. Avoid adjectives and adverbs. That's pretty obvious. I mean, they've got their place, but if you can unpack them, that's almost always going to create a more interesting scene to write, and also that's more valuable for your readers. To avoid your character default settings for reactions, which is kind of what I just said. Have a sidekick or a friend to chat things through. And then if you are trying to identify your main character or a character for your story, maybe you have a couple and you don't know who to pick, find the person who is enduring the most pain in that world, and you'll often find somebody who has the most potential for an interesting story. And then if you're headhunting or head hopping, you got to make sure you break it up very carefully. And if you do it too often, you can lose a sense of what's going on in the scene, so don't do it too much. Okay, I got to go, friends. This was really fun. I made some good progress with my writing this morning. I hope that you did too. If you're watching the replay of this, let us know in the comments what you're writing and what your writing progress is today. I plan to be back again tomorrow morning. Again, if you have any questions, I would love to answer them. We're creating a chill writing community, and I hope that together we can continue making progress. So, till next time, keep writing.